We are delighted to welcome you, Bethany. So, Bethany, tell me, what does a postdoctoral fellow do?
Well, largely, I get the privilege of reading about things and thinking about things. So, uh, a research fellow rather than sort of a teaching fellow or a lecturer does less teaching and more writing, hopefully. So I'm working on the question of what do we do if we cannot stop climate change? And where that leads us theologically and where that leads us practically.
But what do you have for us today, Bethany?
Great. Well, I've come to talk a little bit about my book, Why Is There Suffering? And I'm just so grateful to you for having me and to talk about an issue that is really so important. And as you mentioned, Amber, your sound was coming in and out, but my first book was about the question of animal suffering. And I did that as part of my PhD. And I really wrote this book coming out of that because I both hated and loved my PhD. I loved my doctorate because it gave me time to think about one of the most difficult and pressing issues a Christian can face. Is God really good given all the suffering around us? And of course, my doctorate was not just on suffering humans cause each other, but the type of suffering animals cause each other as well. And I sometimes talk about when I was doing my PhD, it felt like I was doing one PhD for my head and another PhD for my heart. When I was working through these logical questions of, is God really good? Logic was just not enough. I really needed to feel it in my heart and in my gut to be willing to accept an answer. And over the course of my PhD, I did feel like I got to see my heart change, that I grew in trust and love for God while I was exploring these questions. And that's really what I loved about my PhD. But I also hated doing my PhD because most of the books I read were really abstract philosophical books, and they all started with the same warning. Pick up a book on the problem of suffering, and it will say, this is not a book that is for anyone who is suffering. And once they had established that no one who was suffering ought to read these books, they would then illustrate their works using the most graphic examples of suffering imaginable. Stories of concentration camps, stories from human slavery, horrific tortures and abuses were just sort of trotted out in these books so that the authors could not be accused of dealing with suffering in the abstract. So they were trying to prove that they knew what suffering in the real world really looked like. But for me, reading these stories of suffering felt like being plunged through the ice into a frozen lake. Just the shock of these stories was so overwhelming. And then, after you're plunged into a frozen lake, you're then being asked to, I don't know, recite what you had for breakfast last week. It just seemed totally impossible to think about the sort of logical questions of what God is like when you were reading these stories. And I mean, partially that was hard physically because it's very hard to read through tears. And these stories were just hard. So reading the stories of suffering was so shocking that I found that any sort of thinking about the questions I was trying to understand was really impossible. How could I think about why there was suffering when my emotions were so overwhelmed? And yet to do the PhD, I had to. And so I felt that the experience of trying to write about this was really jarring. And it also felt very intrusive of other people's stories. These authors had not, or often could not, ask the peoples whose stories they were using whether that was okay. So I decided to write a different kind of book, one that helps us think about the questions of suffering, but hopefully it will not be so jarring. And one of the things that I did was this book doesn't have any particular examples of suffering. It's not meant to rack emotions or to tug your heart. It's simply meant to paint a picture of the various ways you might want to think about God and suffering. But any examples you bring will have to come from your own life. And that is, after all, the suffering that you have the most information about. When we talk about other people's stories of their suffering, that suffering is their own, and its extent and its meaning is always going to be opaque to us. So I didn't want to write a book where I came in and I said, I have the answer to your suffering, because I don't. So I give various options. I take all the work that has been done by academics in musty libraries over the centuries and try and lay it out as simply and clearly as I can, without the jargon and the technical terms that are usually there in the academy's approach to these things, but also without those sort of heartrending stories. And what I really hope that the book will do is give people the tools they need to figure out the meaning of their own suffering. So the branch of theology that deals with suffering is often called theodicy. And so a person who does that kind of thing, tries to figure out how God is good in light of suffering, is called a theodicist. And so rather than me being the theodicist, I wanted to write a book that would allow other people to become theodicists in their own right. And so I had this sort of question of, how can I give my readers real agency? And how can I give that sort of back and forth about the questions that matter to us that you'd have in a counseling session or in a session with a pastor, where you're talking back and forth and where the discussion is really question-led. And I had a moment where I remembered back to when I was a kid, and I read these novels that were called Choose Your Own Adventure. And the way that they worked was that you would be, say, playing the part of a princess walking through the dark woods, and you'd come to a fork in the path. And if you wanted to go left up to the castle, you would turn to page 8. But if you wanted to go down towards the lake, then you would turn to page 14. And then you'd turn to page 14 to go down to the lake, and then you'd run into a troll. And so if you want to be nice to the troll, you'd turn to page 47. But if you want to be mean to the troll, you'd turn to page 32, wherever. And so the reader gets to make decisions along the way. And so that's how I wrote this book. I wrote it as a sort of pathway of decision making. And Chris, I believe that you have some slides that will help us at this point, so you can get an idea. So this is what I've called the flow chart. And I know the writing is quite small, but essentially this is the book as a whole. You start on the left-hand side, and the very first question is, what is God like? And so you can decide whether you think God is love, whether God exists but doesn't really love us, sort of a deist option, or if you think that there is no God, and then go into the explanations of that. So there's a whole variety of Christian approaches, of different sort of Christian explanations, and then there are non-Christian explanations as well, to give a fuller picture and so that people can see how they engage. Now, I wrote the book like that, and then thought, this is still a bit sterile. It still doesn't have that sense of sort of adventure that I wanted. And so I talked to the publisher, and we came up with the idea to set all of this into a landscape. So Chris, if we can have the next one. So in this book, you're really setting off on a journey across this landscape. You can go up to the mountains of mystery at the top, or you can walk across the open plains of freedom. You can head into the battlefield of divine good against satanic evil, or you can go to the sort of high moors and the forests of atheism, down to the bottom of the map, and explore various pathways through the landscape of theology. And then on the right-hand side, you'll see there's a big river, and the bridge that crosses it is sort of the bridge of death. And so everything beyond that, nearing the end of the book, comes to questions about the afterlife and what happens after death. Because, of course, any Christian explanation of suffering can't be limited to just what's in this world. It has to talk about eternal promises as well. So thanks, you can probably stop that. And so as you walk through this landscape, as you go through, you get a chance to make different decisions. And then of course you can always come back and look through another pathway. And in some ways that seems really appropriate, because there's very different types of explanation that are reasonable in different occasions. And so, if I stub my toe, there are good physical explanations for why I need that suffering to protect myself and to learn how to work in a physical world. But that's a very different kind of suffering from the suffering I might encounter if, somebody I love betrays me or something like that. And that has a much more complex answer. So part of the idea of giving a variety of options was because there are lots of good answers out there that apply to different situations in different ways. And because I don't know what kind of suffering a reader is facing, I let them make the decision for what seems the most appropriate way forward. The other thing that I tried to do was to actually argue for each position with equal vigor. So the atheist paths, after I wrote them, I had my colleague Richard Dawkins read them over and just tell me whether he thought I was being fair. He was happy with it. When I wrote about other positions that I don't necessarily take, I always had somebody from that camp read it over, just to make sure I was being kept honest and to make sure that I was representing them well. Because my ambition is not to secretly argue for one path above the other, but to give as a compelling account as I could for every position, and then let the reader make the choice. Let the reader figure out what seems to make the most sense in light of their experience, their understanding of Scripture, and their community. So that is the approach.
All right. Well, thank you so much for sharing with us the thought that went behind it. Everybody, I'm popping back up again because Amber has been struggling with her internet, and it doesn't look like maybe she might be able to do the Q&A. So I'm coming in here to do a quick audible substitution, whatever sports metaphor you prefer, or whichever country you're in, and I'll take your place to ask some of the Q&A, and we'll just try to keep following. So please remember to use the function on the bottom of the screen to ask a question if you have one. And if you have just a comment, then please use the chat on the right side. I wanted to ask, before, when I was reading the book, I was wondering what it was like to write about the positions that you didn't agree with. And you had mentioned that you were doing that, but you didn't say which ones they were in the book, because you kind of, we'll keep that close to your chest. But I'm interested that how you just commented that you had worked with Richard Dawkins about it. Because it made me think about how we live in a very, at least on the online world, often a very kind of polarized and somewhat oppositional way of communicating that dominates online discourse. And, he's kind of been a part of that too. He's not the only one that does that. But I'm wondering, what was it like working with him outside of that, of the public sphere like that, and trying to connect with someone who believes something very differently than you about this, and using him and having him help you make the book better? What was that like?
Yeah, it was really great. I mean, we initially, he agreed to meet me for lunch because some of his friends at his college, at New College, were friends with me. And so they sort of set it up. And initially, I had just sent him the flow chart that you saw with all of the options. So I sort of walked into where we were having lunch together, and he had it in front of him. And so we talked about that. And it was quite interesting because there certainly was a sense in which he was asking me about, why do you believe these things? Why are you a Christian? And so I sort of had to scratch my head and say, okay, well, I've read the God Delusion, so I know why you think people shouldn't be a Christian, but let me try this. So I said, Richard, I want to ask you a question in return. I'm not trying to trick you at all. It's just the best way I can think of to come up. So I said, why do you speak English? Because as a rationalist, it would seem like speaking Esperanto, the universal language of rationality, would make more sense. That would be a more natural fit in that way. And you have never done that. You have stuck with English, which is this crazy conglomeration with 10,000 exceptions. And the very fact that we speak English shapes how we see the world around us by its use of tense, by its use of gender, by its use of the words that we have available. We don't have a great word like Schadenfreude in German, which means taking great pleasure at other people's suffering. That is a great word, and we just don't have an equivalent for it. And so there are concepts in other languages that shape how we see the world. So I said, Richard, at bottom, this is it. I am a Christian because it is the grammar of my being. It shapes my understanding of the world and its possibilities. And I simply can't learn another language at this point. This has shaped my imagination and my worldview so profoundly that this is what I am. This is where I am. And he sort of stops. That's a better answer than I often get, which was very kind of him. But so kind of coming out of that, where we had a working respect for each other, I think it went really, really well.
It reminds me a bit of Lewis's comment about him believing in God and in Christianity because of the Son, right? I think it's in The Weight of Glory. I can't remember
I believe in Christianity as I believe the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else.
Yeah, exactly. The same sentiment, I feel like I gather. So yeah, sorry, the spectral sort of being that's behind me is my dog trying to get through that. So it's fitting, since you talked about animals in the talk. Maybe we can get to animals here. He heard his name being summoned. But before we get to that, I would like to ask some of the questions that the people have been posting. So a couple here that are interesting to me. Barbara Perry pointed out that the landscape slide is very evocative both of Pilgrim's Progress and then also Lewis's sort of spin on it with Pilgrim's Regress. Did you have any inspiration from like the world of Bunyan and what was that like? Using that?
So I definitely say that this is sort of Pilgrim's Progress-y, and I had a few other people kind of open it up and go, wow, that looks kind of like Tolkien, which the map maker who made it, I can't draw, so I got a map maker to make it, and he's been very pleased with that. I think the major difference is that in the Pilgrim's Progress, and indeed in C.S. Lewis's Regress, there is a right path. This is the path we should be on, and we leave it for various bad reasons. Whereas I'm actually trying to say that if there is a right path, and of course I have my own views on that, I'm not going to tell you what it is. I'm really not trying to argue for one path over another. I want you to figure that out. So I think it's really different in that way. Although, I have exactly used that phrase. It's Pilgrim's Progress-y in working in sort of being set in a landscape and having a sense of story around what are basically theological options.
Yeah, I'm interested in the phrase, because there's a delicate approach here, and I think maybe people would probably be interested about the weighing of the scales between pragmatism and kind of figuring out how we understand what's happening to us and our individual subjective experiences versus whether there is like an ultimate satisfying answer or not to why we suffer. And so, I could see like with the book, since it's, even though it does not use a lot of specific examples of suffering, is geared towards helping people who are, more than maybe a philosophical treatise that's trying to just give the answer or possibly give an answer. how do you navigate that and still like adhere to the ideas that there's ultimate truth and maybe one we can't understand, and but also emphasizing pragmatism without falling into like relativism?
Yeah. So I'm not actually a relativist, though I probably sound like it some of the time. In trying to not show the cards in my hands, the way that the reason I didn't just say actually this way is the best is because I've watched people I love suffer over the years, faithful Christians from different places, and they found a deep, deep comfort in very different explanations. And I just was so intrigued by that. I was really sort of taken aback, because I would have thought, well, the best answer is going to be the best answer. And so I remember I see that there's a question asking what focused my academic work on the problem of suffering. And this is actually relevant to answering this, is that I was in a church where there was a pastor who was just quite manipulative, quite power hungry, and was starting to destroy the fabric of the church. And I remember just being so upset by this, God, how come you're not defending your church? This person keeps saying they're speaking in your name when so clearly they're not. And at the same time, I was at Bible College, where we were all very enthusiastic about having the right answer. And I remember finding that some people would offer me absolutely orthodox answers, and I just hated it with all my heart. And other people offered me other orthodox answers, and I loved it. But I knew that the people who offered me the answers that I was really reacting against had themselves suffered seriously and had found those answers as sustaining and spiritually nurturing. And so I couldn't just reject them as, well, you're wrong or naive, or you don't really know what this is like, because I knew that they had. Mm-hmm. And so I think I've come to a view that sort of says sometimes our theological positions can be a bit like the food we eat, where we can have allergies to a particular food for a particular reason. So if I have a wheat allergy, it's not saying anything bad about wheat or its nutrition or its goodness to say that will make me really ill to have, and vice versa. Somebody else is allergic to something else and they react poorly to that. And it's not saying anything about the goodness of that food. And so I think our theological models, I think of one like God as Father. There are a lot of people who've had terrible fathers, and we simply find that they have a real difficult time thinking of God primarily as Father, despite the fact that it's a beautiful, rich description of God. It's biblical. It has all these things going for it. Their reaction to it is just, I'm allergic to this. And sometimes as Christians, we want to just double down. Well, I'm just going to force feed this to you until you get enough of it that you can be all right. And I just wanted to have a gentler approach, particularly because my reaction to reading all of these books on suffering was myself so reactive that I had such a hard time with people saying, well, clearly this is the answer. So this approach may not be the right thing for everybody. Not everybody may find it helpful, but I wanted to sort of first do no harm. First, have a gentle approach that lets readers really take the initiative and have the agency in the situation, rather than me as the author having all the agency. And so I think in the introduction, I even say, if none of these work, feel free to write your own path. This isn't comprehensive. It's an exercise to help you articulate what you think.
So there's a great question that Mike Habits has asked in the chat, and I want to ask the first half and then maybe connect it to what you just said and then ask the second half after. So the first part is more of a comment about how part of Lewis's appeal is that he sees in Mere Christianity and in his own work, he makes Mere Christianity compelling as though it's the truth, right? And so I wanted to maybe connect that to what you just said, because, in his own life, he had to deal with this dual approach to how to answer suffering, right? He has the philosophical academic approach to it and the problem of pain, which maybe isn't always necessary. Even if a lot of the answers are the same, the experience of that is very different in a grief observed, right? Do you see that in him? Do you see that as kind of like trying to come at the same question in like two different angles, and Lewis maybe as a model of that?
Yeah, and I think we see him changing his views, and and I think that his time as an atheist was actually very important to what he was doing. So so he starts as a Christian in Northern Ireland, Belfast, but then he drops that. He becomes an atheist for a while. And I think that was actually an important part of his spiritual journey as well, back into Christianity. He needed some distance for a while. And many of you will know of the work of Alistair McGrath, who also grew up in Northern Ireland and also went through atheism for a time. And so I think that there are points where just like with the sort of allergy analogy, there may be points where Christianity is difficult to see when you're too close. And there's a need for moving out. So the Bishop of London, actually, Amber was there when I met him in London. He talked about the difficulty of seeing the light of the gospel when there's so much light pollution in our world. And so I think that there are times and places where Christianity's compelling nature is probably more easily seen from a different vantage point.
Well, so that connects directly to the second half of the question, which is that, in writing it, were you concerned in the book, he wants to know, about how compelling you were making Christianity seem as an alternative to the other? I mean, there's different versions of Christianity that pop up in the text, but then you also have, non-Christian or atheist perspectives too. Were you concerned to take on an apologetic role at all, or how did you navigate that?
I really tried to avoid having an apologetic role. So I tried to make it so that if somebody was an atheist and they picked it up, they would feel that I had dealt with their view honestly and compellingly. So I tried to write as persuasively as I could for every possibility I put forward. Whether I succeeded or not, I don't know, but I wanted to be, again, as honest as I could in terms of saying this is why people hold those positions. So essentially what I did was I played a mind game and sort of said, okay, if I held that position, what do I think would be the strongest argument I could make for it? And then I wrote that down. And to double check, I then went to, people from those communities and said, okay, can you read this and make sure I've got it right and correct me if I've got it wrong? But actually, I mean, I have a variety of Christian views, as you put, and some of them were actually harder to write than some of the atheist positions. So I don't agree with all the necessarily Christian approaches I have in the book either.
Yeah, you had mentioned that. So I know you have maybe not wanted to weigh in 100%, but I was kind of wondering which ones maybe you do resonate with more and which ones maybe you don't, or is that not something you want to say about the book?
I mean, insofar as I wrote on each of these, I tried to write about the parts that resonated with me most on all of them. So I think all of them have strengths, have advantages, and some of them have disadvantages as well. And I really tried to do that as straightforwardly as I could. I don't really want to put my cards on the table and say, this is where I end up. But some people who know me very, very well said, well, I saw a particular emphasis here that sort of tipped me off. But
yeah, I mean, is there like a pragmatically speaking one that you feel speaks to you personally. Maybe it isn't the best one for somebody else, but
when I talked about being at that church and sort of changing my views, the one that I discovered and found really helpful was sort of more of an open theist approach. So, and that's not a secret. If you look online, people would find that I have written about and in defense of open theism in the past. But the reason I think I could write compellingly for other positions is because I think that they have a lot going for them.
Yeah, could you say a little bit more about what that is for some of the registrants who maybe are not familiar with it?
So open theism really holds that the future is open, that God creates the future with us rather than having a determined plan that everything is according to a reason. So if you think that everything is happening for a particular reason, then we know that God will work everything out because everything's already been determined. Everything's been set out. God's outside of time. God has already seen what will happen. But if God has given up knowledge of the future, then we're co-creating it together. And that means that sometimes at the point that something happens, there's no particularly better reason for it to have happened. But God will make a good reason. So I think Thomas Merton says, the grace of Christ is to take our useless suffering and turn it into something that is not useless, that is sensible after all.
Yeah, thank you. Because I think that, that term, I think, sounds a little bit more maybe ominous than it really is, right? The term open theism. So I think that example is very helpful. Ken makes a couple comments about the food allergy thing being apt. As someone who I also have food allergies, so I sympathize with it. And then he mentions about how just given the variety of different types of suffering people endure, maybe there, if there really is a one size fit all answer, if there is, it probably isn't one that we would be able to apprehend now.
No, I think I can run with that, because I think that if we're talking about the nature of God, it is clearly beyond the capacity of any of our heads to get around. And so as I've learned more and more and more about theology, I've become less and less and less certain about most of the things that I would affirm. And that's not because, I'm a raging relativist, but because I realize that actually all these different things, that the best we can do with our theology is create a model of God. And so if you think of a model train, some of the things are going to be accurate to the real train, but it will never be as complex or as varied or as functional as the real thing. And so somebody else making their own model with differences is going to highlight things that I've missed, and that can only be to the good. So I think that exploring other theological positions, even if they're uncomfortable, even if you think, I definitely think this is wrong, it might still give you a different perspective on God that is hopefully helpful. And so part of the book is to really invite people into that journey without a sense that they have to take up this other position, but just explore. You don't have to agree with any of the positions I've written, but have fun in the exploration.
There's an interesting comment that Elizabeth Jennings made. This isn't really a question, but I'd like to kind of turn it into one, where she says she came to peace with suffering in a silent retreat at age 25 when she understood experientially that suffering is real but not ultimate, and that only the love of God is ultimate. There are layers of reality, and suffering is not the bedrock. Which I think, I kind of wanted to maybe turn that in. Is that similar to like Augustine's maybe understanding about how ultimately suffering and evil maybe don't have ultimate reality? They're perversions of good things that eventually will one day be dispensed with and will not exist any longer. And do you find that a useful way to think about it?
Yeah. So you can explore that view by meeting a monk. I think it's chapter 14, but it's basically this idea that evil is a privation of the good. It's not a thing in itself. So I have light in this room, and light is a real thing. There are photons hitting my face that are real physical entities. Whereas if I cut my hands, if I could show you, I've got darkness in there, but I didn't create darkness. The best I could do was block out the light that is the real thing. And so Augustine, to some extent, Aquinas even more, pulls out how evil is not a thing. It's the lack of a good thing. And so the ultimate is the light. The ultimate is reality. And where we see evil, it's like cupping bits of reality away from God. And that's what makes it, but it seems, when you're surrounded by dark, it sure seems really real, but it's actually just a lack.
I think that's similar to why Lewis ultimately rejects dualism as like a valid philosophy for him. I think in some of his essays, right, that he can't abide the idea that evil is an actual thing itself. It can't be existent alongside with the good and with God, or else it would have too much power and too much reality. And actually, so this connects. I've been wanting to circle around to an interesting question that Les Bonham asked about maybe portrayals of suffering. So even though when we talk about it being maybe not a real thing in Augustine or Aquinas's words, that can maybe inadvertently trivialize it. And so what about, because it's real, even if you say it doesn't have its own existence, it's real, right? Which is a paradox. But Les wants to know about depictions of suffering as like a being itself, and what instances of that or treatments of that, as opposed to a condition or a thing that like afflicts you. And how, and what that might be like and how we might deal with that.
Yeah. So I think that there are, a number of scholars who would describe the existence of evil, both in the world and in the sort of animal world, as a result of sort of a war between God and Satan. And so the reason that things are so tough is that we're in the midst of the battlefield, basically. And insofar as that is a useful explanation. What it says God's not happy with our suffering. God doesn't intend this to happen, but this happens for various other reasons. Sorry about that.
No problem.
And so with evil being a being, and certainly there are a lot of people who describe there are a lot of people who describe encountering evil as seeming to be, demons or that sort of thing. And again, I hold my hands and say, I don't know the reality of that. It's not something I've experienced myself, but the world is a bigger and more interesting place than I could imagine. So, so I've included that as a possibility that, this is why evil, and why it has that force that it does, because when you encounter hate or malice, it doesn't feel like a lack. It feels like something positive.
That gets to the same tension you've been talking about how to square some of the philosophical abstractions that make sense and with our experience, which maybe are both true, but can have a sort of paradoxical feel to it. One question that I think a number of us have been wondering, and that my dog has been wandering around. He's getting very old. That's part of why he's a little restless right now. And so that made me want to ask about your writing your doctoral dissertation, and also in this book about the question of animal suffering. And maybe if you could talk a little bit about your research on that, and what the questions are, and what are the problems and solutions that people have proposed. This is something Lewis was very into. Lewis loved animals and was very interested in this. But yeah.
Yeah, for the most part, it's actually just very similar. So part of the reason I did animal suffering is it's kind of like human suffering minus the element of sin, the ways we did it. So it's a little bit of a simpler problem, but many of the same kind of answers come out. They come out as, well, it's because we need freedom to develop skills and to encounter our world honestly. Maybe they suffer because a demonic presence has messed up evolution from the beginning. Maybe there's suffering because there's no other way that God could create and get the values God wants in the world, of love and self-expression without the possibility of pain. And so, the majority of this book doesn't deal with animal suffering particularly, there is in the afterlife part. So, you've crossed over.
Should I pull up the picture again?
Yeah.
Yeah, let me share it again. Here we go.
On the right-hand side there, you see 34 going across the river. One of the options there is to say, I'm tired of talking about humans. I want to hear about animals. And so you can peel up there to 35, 36, and 37. And for those of you, this is the C.S. Lewis Foundation, the 37 there, that's actually the Kilns at C.S. Lewis's home, and you can stop off for tea with the great scholar there in that chapter and talk to him about his views on animals and the resurrection.
Yeah, I appreciate you mentioning that, because I have always been troubled by that question of animal suffering, because the answer that to me always made the most sense about human suffering was the free will theodicy, right? The famous Alvin Plantinga or whoever, the answers about we use and abuse our freedom, and that's why we do terrible things to each other. And how that, but then, that answer, which always seems so persuasive to me with people, doesn't really apply to animals. And so I'm wondering what you think about that.
Well, and that's part of the reason, that I wanted to look at it, was because it gave other options. And that the free will argument does actually find its way into that discussion in its own ways. That they may not have free will, but they have free agency that's equally important. But I think as with any theodicy, really looking at whether there's a promise beyond death is important. And most people just think, well, don't animals not have souls? And actually, that's a really quite new development. So in the Aristotelian thought that informed much of early Christianity, of course, animals had souls. They simply didn't have rational souls, but they had animal souls, and those were important. Now, somebody like Aquinas thought that an animal soul couldn't survive death, but because we don't sort of divide body and soul in the same way, most scholars today go back to sort of a Hebraic view, where the soul is the form of the body, and so if you have a body, you have a soul, and that's why Christians believe in the resurrection of the body.
Yeah, Elizabeth mentions about on the chat here, it'd be ironic to say animals don't have souls, and the word for soul in the Latin anima is the origin of the word for animal.
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I study Eastern Orthodoxy a lot. I'm Eastern Orthodox myself, and so there's a long tradition of seeing spirituality within other created beings other than people. And I think even there's one researcher in Sweden named Thomas Arensen who even has studied how some Byzantines thought that trees had souls. In addition to animals.
They certainly, anything that lived and grew had at least a vegetative soul.
Yeah.
So, that has long roots in the in the Christian tradition as well.
The Maximus the Confessor or so. Yeah. Very good.
Yeah.
Well, sorry.
For me is the scope of redemption is simply the answer to what does God love. I think everything God loves has a chance at new life.
I do have to throw it to Joshua real quick in a second for announcements. I did want to ask real quick that Amber pointed out about how you did a lot of this research when you were at the Kilns. And so I did want to ask about that, since I think our audience would be really interested in it. You lived there. How long did you live there, and how did it impact your study?
I was there for 4 years. I'd actually finished my PhD by that time. So I wasn't doing my PhD then. That came after. But I was writing my first book on evolution. And actually, I wrote the majority of this while I was there. So actually, quite often, I would be sitting either in his study or down in the common room, for those who have been there, while I wrote these chapters. And then just for good measure, we would go to the Eagle and Child, and I read out many of the early chapters to a couple of friends while we sat there. So Lewis was very much at the forefront of my mind. And when I needed inspiration, I'd often spend time reading his work, because his language is so rich and so wonderful. and evocative, and it would just spark my imagination. So I definitely used both the inspiration of the Kilns and the inspiration of Lewis in writing this.
Very good. Let's I'll bring in Josh real quick for announcements, and then we'll end with maybe one or two questions before concluding.
Hi, Chris and Bethany. It is great to see you both. And Bethany, thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Joshua George. I have been volunteering with the foundation since the beginning of the year. But before I give a few updates, I want to say thank you to all of our partners and our volunteers, our staff and supporters. The foundation's mission is inspired by the life of C.S. Lewis to encourage and equip Christians to live out their faith in the world of ideas and the arts. If you would like to support the continued production of these webinars and many of the other programs that the foundation puts on, please consider joining us by making a gift today through our website at cslewis.org/give. I don't have any information yet on our next webinar because our December event will be held in person. After 2 years of online events, we are excited to meet in person together again near Houston at the Camp Allen Conference Center in Navasota, Texas, from December 3rd through the 5th. The C.S. Lewis Retreat is for readers, writers, and mere Christians. Whether you are a fan of C.S. Lewis or you're new to his writings, you'll enjoy inspiring lectures, stimulating breakout sessions, meaningful worship services, and rich artistic performances. We do understand that some people are not quite ready to meet in person, and we're excited to announce that we are offering an online component to this year. This will give you an opportunity to join us during some of the sessions throughout this year's C.S. Lewis Retreat. For more information on both options and to register, visit cslewis.org. And the last announcement we have is registration is also open for next year's C.S. Lewis Oxbridge Summer Institute, located in Oxford, England, next July. Early registration has just been extended through November 19th. So to learn more about this truly memorable experience and to register today, again, visit cslewis.org. Chris and Bethany, I will turn it back over to you.
All right, thank you so much, Josh. We appreciate that. One thing, normally we end with kind of the same question, but there was one that came in from Mike Habits again right before the announcements that I did want to ask because it interests me as well.
Sorry,
it disappeared. Here it is.
Over and answered.
Did you respond? Oh, you did. Okay.
By text, but only for privately, so you may still ask it.
Yeah, I was just interested in this question of the way that a lot of these questions are answered by something called panentheism, which Lewis was not, but maybe someone like Christopher Southgate, I believe you've worked with. He is someone who's influenced me is Sergei Bulgakov, who is a panentheist. And so maybe I did kind of want to address that question real quick before we conclude with our final one.
Yeah. So the idea of panentheism is that God is not merely outside the world, but is actively involved and is affected by the world while holding some transcendence. So I think the easiest way is to think of God as being transcendent, but also being intimately in with the world and being affected by it. And I do think that is useful because it means that God suffers with us. And I think if you have God who is just outside of things, it can't actually be affected by us in the way that Aquinas, for example, would have believed. It means that if you're suffering on your own, you really are suffering on your own. So I think that what panentheism allows is the idea that God really does suffer with us, that God doesn't volunteer us. God's not sort of the lab master sending us through the maze of this world while standing back, but is intrinsically experiencing with us the suffering of creation. And of course, that doesn't mean that suffering won't be bad or that it doesn't need to be solved. It does, but it changes how we see God and God's love.
That we'll have to have another talk sometime to get more into the weeds there with that. I think, a question of divine impassibility and can God feel pain and I know you address this in the book. One of your chapters is about impassibility. That's probably not something we can't get into right now here at the end, but very interesting.
I don't use the word impassibility.
You don't? Okay. Maybe I just knew that that's what you meant, and so I imbibed it, internally. My undergrad thesis was on impassibility, so it's something I've been interested in a long time. But the last thing I wanted to conclude with, and before we let you go and get the last word, was just we always want to ask the scholars and artists and people that we bring on how their work has and their study has impacted their lives as Christians.
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, is impossible to answer in full. But I think that what I've found is that exploring these questions and really getting into the weeds of what I believe about God, I'd often heard that if you study theology, you'll lose your faith. And I think that just the opposite has happened. That as I've studied, as I've become, as I said earlier, more uncertain, I've also had a growing faith that has matched that. So there's more and more that I don't have a definite answer for, but I have trust that in God who holds on to me. I don't need to hold on to God. It's more like being on a zip line where the journey is really exciting, but I'm held securely by God's love, rather than me thinking I've got to hang on, for all I've got. And so if it's done anything, I think studying these really difficult questions has allowed me to relax much more. Even when I encounter suffering, I'm far less reactive, and I don't need to find meaning right away, because I know meaning will ultimately be found in God.
Well, thank you for sharing and telling us some personal perspective. Thank you for sharing about the book. I definitely recommend everybody to go out and check it out. It's a very interesting, creative, and an unusual but very helpful approach to how to address such a difficult question, and easy to read and understand, which is not easy to do. So quite an accomplishment to do all those things together. But now I'll conclude real quick with a short prayer. I am a very liturgical person. I'm not very good at the extemporaneous, so I'll conclude with the Lord's Prayer. So, our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever and ever. Amen.